Good evening and welcome to episode 62. Welcome welcome to episode 62 of the Political Mic. It's a privilege and honor to be among such distinguished individuals again for this 60-second panel discussion. But I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the introductions. We have, of course, someone who is no stranger to the political mic, Nate Honore, who is a 3L at Quinnipiac University School of Law. We also have Star Davis, who resides in Columbus, Ohio. She works at the Ohio State University Office of Diversity and Inclusion, where she manages the Graduate and Professional Recruitment Initiative. We also have coming on the show later on Mr. Arsene Frederick Jr., who is a Florida native and an education equity advocate. He formerly served as the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Aerospace Defense and Policy Fellow. Arsene is placed within the Executive Office of the Vice President of the United States. He's now a full-time PhD student at Howard University, Higher Education Leadership and Policy Studies program. He's also a graduate of the American University School of Public Affairs and holds a master's of public administration with a concentration in public financial management. You also have Christopher Harvey, who is a seasoned political and public policy professional with over 10 years worth of professional experience in both the public and private sectors. He currently serves as the Deputy Policy Director for the Chris Jones for Governor campaign in Arkansas. Most recently, he was appointed to serve as Commissioner, Ward 3, on Racial and Cultural Diversity Commission with the City of Little Rock. So, Chris, it is an honor to have you. It's my first time having you as a guest on the show, so I'm excited to see what you bring to the table. And last but certainly not least at all, Professor Fred Cook, who always adds a wealth of knowledge. He has been an adjunct professor of Howard University School of Law since 1992. He's one of the founding members of the Black Entertainment and Sports Lawyers Association, a member of the Washington Bar Association Hall of Fame, and a Washingtonian Magazine Top Lawyer awardee. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to jump right into it. Last week, of course, we witnessed, I believe, 2 shootings. We had a shooting in a public space, and I've always been afraid every time I go onto the public transit, especially the subways. I always think, anything could happen. You don't have to go through screening. You don't have to go through the level of scrutiny that you have to go through in the airport. And so, the situation that happened in Brooklyn was a worst case scenario and always a nightmare of mine. And then that was followed by another shooting that took place at a house party in an Airbnb where everyone was clamoring to get to the door. So the Biden administration Tuesday announced changes. Let me see. Last week, actually, announced a new ATF chief. The White House this past Monday unveiled a new slate of measures aimed at curbing increase in gun violence, and announced the nomination of Steve Dettelbach to serve as director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. President Biden previously announced David Chipman as the person who's going to take that role. But Biden withdrew that nomination in September because he got resistance from centrist Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. My question, and I want to throw this out, and I have my theories on it. But in your view, do you think that the new rule implemented by the Biden Justice Department, which bans the business of manufacturing the most accessible ghost guns, those are guns that don't have a serial number, do you think that new rule is going to prove to be effective in curbing the amount of ghost guns that are in circulation currently?
Well, Mike, it all depends.
Go ahead and unmute, Professor.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to get in Mr. Honore's way. No, I don't really think it's going to make any difference. I think there's too many of them already out there. The ability to make these things is a sort of horse out of the barn proposition. So yeah, and then this sounds like I'm working for the NRA, but when you do this, you're only making the people who have a conscience stop. The people who don't have a conscience are going to continue to do it because the technology is already out there and available. So while I don't oppose the legislation or the approach at all, I just don't think it's going to have much of a net positive effect.
I agree with Professor Cook. It also depends, every rule depends on competent enforcers and, people to oversee and manage the implementation of these rules. But the current state of ATF is actually a testament to the power of the NRA lobby. In 2006, it was when ATF directors had to be Senate approved, and that was a change that the NRA spent a lot of money trying to approve of, to make ATF directors subject to Senate approval. Then, once that change came into effect, the ATF killed a bunch, the NRA spent a bunch of money killing various ATF nominees, and that's why there has not been a permanent director of the ATF since 2015, one who was approved by the Senate. So, this is definitely a problem, but it's not a problem that the gun lobby is willing to allow to be solved.
Yeah, definitely. So I definitely agree with Professor Cook and Nathan about, essentially while this ban or this new rule wouldn't really affect the guns that are already out there, but I will say at least it's something. It's not the end all be all, but at least it's something that they are doing to at least address it. So as far as with people being able to purchase new ones or the manufacturers, at least there's a process that's going to be starting that, will require them to register, have the serial numbers. And so it's a start and hopefully a way to maybe deter it. So it's kind of like a Band-Aid in a way, but at least to say, they can at least say, well, look, at least we're trying to do something about it, or here's what we've done to at least address this issue.
And I really appreciated what David Hogg, who's one of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas students, said. He said, if you have 50% of the power, you get 50% of what you want done. And that kind of mindset of expecting incremental change, I think, goes a long way. Like you mentioned, Christopher, when you're looking at the amount of people who had high hopes for there being finally some kind of gun reform legislation in place, especially because Biden was often deployed as the deal maker during the Obama years. He was the one that was supposed to thaw the ice with McConnell and the other congressional and Senate leaders. Folks could probably get this notion that this was definitely something that was going to take off. But when you have, like Nate pointed out, such strong opposition, and then you have such, imposing influence from the NRA and folks like Manchin who are, pride themselves in taking this kind of no man's land approach, this kind of third party branch approach to, curbing gun violence and implementing gun reforms. Biden's high hopes of having a payback program seems after a while pie in the sky. But the new Justice Department rule that bans the business of manufacturing most accessible guns. Do you think that contradicts Biden's campaign promise of the fact that he said he was not going to confiscate firearms already in circulation?
No, I don't think it's a step back from that. But the challenge that Mr. Biden and many so-called Democrats have is their absolute reluctance to confront head-on the issue of gun violence, of regulation of guns, because they're so afraid of being categorized as soft on crime, violating my constitutional rights, and they won't speak to the issue in rational ways. Mr. Harvey has a governor, Asa Hutchinson, who was the director of ATF at one point in time, a relatively sane man in the Republican cosmos, and did in fact do some things in regard to trying to stem the flow of guns into the United States, into the various states at the federal level. But the Democrats just don't seem to have an appetite to confront the issue the way many members of the American public seem to want them to, for fear of the noisy minority characterizing them as these horrible, I'm going to come into your house and take your gun people and violate your constitutional rights. And so I don't think this is a step back, a renege on the promise. But I think that what Mr. Biden is afraid of is that that's going to be the noise that he has to put up with, and it's going to resonate among a minority of the citizens in a politically consequent way.
So that being said, is there any hope at all for any kind of gun reform legislation before November, in your view?
No, I don't.
Knows.
Absolutely not.
That was short, but you know, it's cynical, but at the same time, you know, I'm wondering if folks are so jaded now. You know, we said we were going to have the Build Back Better implementation, and then that shifted to, okay, we're going to have pieces of it in action, and you know, people are not seeing things as fast as they want in terms of not just gun reform, but even in the realm of immigration, like we'll touch on a little bit later today. And I'm wondering if that's going to, in your view, impact voter turnout. Usually the Democrats do poorly in midterm off-year elections. 2018, I think, was an anomaly. 1998 was an anomaly. But, you know, things are progressing the way they are. In your view, does that mindset that you guys just expressed, you know, no, I'm not expecting to see any kind of legislation, would that serve as a debilitating factor for the Democratic Party, who's hoping to come up with, you know, some kind of voter enthusiasm and turnout?
Yeah, so I definitely think that, you know, a big focus of Democrats should be, and especially now the fact that we are in an election year, and as you said, usually the party in power that's controlling the presidency, usually that first midterm is when you see, you know, that power reversed. Well, we saw it with President Obama, and then we also saw it with President Trump in 2010 and, you know, 2018. But I think that the focus is definitely going to have to be like, here's what we've done since we've been in power. And if the messaging, and that's the big thing that, you know, people, have their comments about Democrats, like our messaging, is not consistent like you see with Republicans. It's like everyone is like lockstep and key, saying the same thing, saying the same keywords, buzzwords. And so I definitely think that messaging for the Democrats is going to be important to tell people like, yes, I know you've probably heard a lot of things that's going on, but look, here's what we've done. Since we've been in power, since President Biden has been in office. And so that's going to be important. And then also showing how the accomplishments have affected people's day-to-day life. I think a lot of people get lost on the fact that, you know, they'll see the news and they hear the news, but a lot of people don't understand how a lot of these decisions are affecting their day-to-day life. And so if the Democrats, if they can focus that energy on showing people what they've done and how their life, how they've been made better than before, that's going to be something that's going to be important. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. History doesn't have to show itself every time, each, off year election. But it's really going to take key messaging and for all Democrats to be on that same wavelength to be able to accurately describe their accomplishments and make the case. This is what you're voting for, not what you're. This is not about what you're voting against. We want you to know this is what you're voting for, what you're wanting to continue, and so that's going to be really important moving forward for Democrats.
I totally agree to that. I feel like there's two ways that I look at this conversation, or two kind of dimensions in which I separate this conversation into. So one aspect, there's the constituency. Then on the other aspect, there's the negotiators. And so Democrats right now have a majority in the House and the Senate, and as well as the presidency. And so they are positioned as the negotiators to get that return on investment that a lot of voters across the country put them in office to essentially do. So we know Democrats have essentially brought reforms to the public service loan forgiveness program. We know that at least in the House, the HR 1 for voting has passed. We know that the George Floyd Justice of Policing Act has passed. And so to your point, Christopher, you're exactly right. It's going to take Democrats telling that story to folks who are across the country, getting to those urban communities, getting to those rural communities, and really just helping folks understand, hey, this is what we've done. And for what has not passed in the Senate and has not gone to President Joe Biden's desk to be signed into law, just know that it's passed in the House.
Yeah, and on that note, you even have, but at the same time, while it's important because you had President Obama saying, look, the Democrats have a story to tell, they just got to tell it. And then you're like, well, what does that mean? And so I remember the DNC chair, Jamie Harrison, explaining, just like you did, Arsene. And so we can get so caught up in the idea that, the election was a close election when you look at the electoral vote count. But when you look at the popular vote count, I mean, the majority of the majority of citizens agree with these policies, and polls show it. But at the same time, you also have Democrats running in purple states, Senate Democratic candidates running in purple states, trying to distance themselves from Biden as it pertains to his plans to end pandemic era border restrictions. What falls under Title 42. John Fetterman, the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, who's running for Senate, says he's 100% behind the Biden agenda, with that exception. He and the front runner for the state's Democratic Senate nomination, they're distancing themselves from President Joe Biden's plans. And they're not alone. I mean, you have other folks in other purple states doing the same thing. You have even Senator Warnock in Georgia being attacked for, seemingly to be on the support for Biden's plans to end the pandemic era policy as it pertains to immigration. And so with that in mind, I want to ask you guys, should President Biden capitulate, in your view, to the GOP and reverse his decision to end the use of Title 42, which allowed former President Trump to limit immigration during the pandemic? Would that be a move that he could do just before November? And then after November, if things go, slightly in the Democrats' directions, you start to put things in place as it pertains to making it easier to attain citizenship?
No, because I don't think it gets you any votes that have any permanence about it. This isn't something that you're going to do that's going to change or persuade the largely unpersuadables. So I don't think you ought to back up on principles, if you have any, in an attempt to get this sort of mythical vote of these people out there that the Democrats seem to be fascinated with trying to recruit to become Democratic Party voters that just don't seem to actually exist. I think that part of what you got to do, I mean, I saw a piece yesterday that Rob Reiner, the comedian, actor, director person, wrote, basically saying that if you vote for Republicans, you're voting for an anti-democratic person. And while that might be characterized to some degree as hyperbolic campaign kind of rhetoric, in this particular environment, that has a lot of reality to it. So Democrats shouldn't get so caught up in that we haven't gotten 100% of what Joe Biden promised, because there's active, vicious opposition to it by a bunch of crazy people who call themselves Republicans. So it's difficult to get there in the form of government we have. But don't focus on the fact that we didn't get 100%. Focus on the things that we got. Talk about it like you folks have talked about already. But also talk about how these Republicans are anti-democratic. If you think things are bad now because Joe Biden didn't get 100% of what he wanted, what's going to happen when one of these yahoos who calls themselves a Republican gets elected, and what's your world going to look like? And while that might be paranoid in some people's view, I think it's very, very real when you look at the kind of things that people who call themselves Republican are doing across this country on so many levels, in so many aspects of human life and conduct. As something whoever would have thought that a sitting governor, Republican governor in a state like Florida, would attack Walt Disney World, would attack this economic engine in their state because they had the temerity to disagree with him politically, to take a public position that was in disagreement with him. Republicans who are all about business and government, keep your hands off business, let business do what it does because it's the engine that runs America, is now going to attack these guys because they had the temerity to disagree with them.
Yeah, and DeSantis, who is, lining up his resume for 24 or 28, he is trying to take away Disney's special tax exemption, which, I mean, from the time you start to try to wage war against such a not just a brand name, but such a company that has made its mark and in such a way where its influence is not just in cartoons or movies, but you have Disney's influence in ABC News. You have Disney's influence everywhere. I mean, and so if you're going to wage war against that, and your idea is that, well, let me just say it this way: it's obvious that he's pandering to a particular group, and he's not looking to convince anyone on the other side to jump on board or to see things in his way. But as it pertains to these Democrats, a lot of the criticism that they're giving the Biden administration is that they don't agree with the way they would go about phasing out Title 42. They think that there needs to be a plan in place. And so in your view, do you agree with those Democrats, not just Fetterman, but you have the leading presumptive Democratic nominee in North Carolina for that Senate race, Cherry Beasley, saying the same thing? Because, in your view, would it be political suicide to take a position that's against that for those kinds of folks running in North Carolina, running in Pennsylvania? What do you guys think?
Well, there should be some. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that I think that and this is actually surprisingly, sort of a bipartisan issue. You're seeing senators on both sides of the aisle that are saying that, hold on for a second, let's think about this before you do this. And I honestly think that is something that's reasonable. I mean, we're hearing a lot about a lot of the COVID cases that are getting ready to go up. And members are expressing concerns about that. And I definitely think that is something that the Biden administration should take into consideration, especially when you have a majority of citizens saying that they agree with keeping that in place. So it's definitely something that should be considered. And especially if you have both sides of the aisle coming together saying, before you do this, let's think about this. Let's come up with an effective way that we can show that, we're still being safe, but still humane all at the same time. But I think that's going to be something that's going to be important. And it's definitely a conundrum for the administration.
There definitely should be some sort of process to phase migrant processing at the southern border, absolutely. But that level of nuance is not something that's translating into the discussion as we talk about Democratic senators and Democratic contenders for the Senate saying that we need to pump the brakes on Title 42. They see it as even the radical members of Biden's own radical party are saying that this thing Biden is doing is way too radical. Now, the fact of the matter is that Title 42 is an emergency procedure, meaning if you want to say the pandemic is over, that the emergency of the pandemic is over, then we shouldn't be holding on to emergency restrictions. But there's not someone in the Democratic Party who's able to communicate that effectively. And there's not someone who's running who's able to say, I don't disagree with ending Title 42. I just disagree with just opening all the doors again. So it doesn't really matter either way.
And that's the thing, like, it doesn't matter how many times you try to make it look like you're against the administration. If you're going to be up against someone who's just a hardcore anti-immigrant, like a Republican, who do you think they're going to choose at the end of the day? You, who they portray, you're still a Democrat. And so you still have the brand. And so they're still going to paint you as someone who is lockstep with those who take a more liberal position. So why not go ahead and try to explain fully what you mean in terms of why you're not in agreement with phasing out Title 42 at this point? Sounding so much like a conservative, but at the expense of your own political detriment, because no matter what, they're still going to choose at the end of the day the R by the person's name.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is specifically for a lot of senatorial candidates, they're running in regions and places that are, or running for positions that are statewide. And so while you can think about somewhere like California, right, where we generally understand it as blue, where you have those places that are red or where you have those places that are purple, they matter as well, especially when you're running as a senatorial candidate for a statewide position. So I think what's being brushed up against, or what is sort of happening here, is this issue of political messaging, right? Of how you think about to what a lot of my colleagues on the panel was essentially speaking about, political messaging in the sense of when you think about how this plan is essentially being phased out and what the implications will ultimately be for the landscape across the U.S. I mean, if you ask me, the reality of the situation is, if you think back all the way early on, when the pandemic first started, the public health infrastructure in our country was not necessarily good, even in a domestic sense, right? For the folks who are, just here. And so to take a step further and kind of grapple with political messaging that says, someone will possibly, bring something here, I think you're kind of running a slippery slope on that front. And so more is to be revealed on this front as it relates to the policy itself being phased out. But by and large, I do think it's that issue of political messaging in the sense of what are the voters going to think about this, especially for the continuity or the longevity of one's political career.
Yeah. And, we mentioned briefly DeSantis and Disney. Just for the viewers, DeSantis on Tuesday announced that Florida's GOP-controlled legislature would be considering legislation that would sunset special districts formed in the state prior to 1968. And this would include the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which houses Disney's theme park. Lawmakers would also seek to eliminate Disney's exemption to a previously approved law aimed at cracking down on tech companies. So why is Governor DeSantis doing this? He's doing this. Well, he and Disney have been in feud for months, and he's doing this in response to Disney's criticism of DeSantis for his opposition to his support, for the Don't Say Gay bill. Well, that's the term that has been used to characterize this bill. The bill bans classroom instruction on gender identity and sexual orientation from kindergarten through third grade. And this isn't, to me, it's the same tune that the gentleman of Virginia, the governor of Virginia, was singing when he was running against Terry McAuliffe. This idea that there's indoctrination going on in these public schools, liberal indoctrination, and we've got to stop it. It's no longer a debate about policy. Now we've got to ban books and we've got to rewrite history. We can't have any kind of discussion of certain times in history that could lead to students feeling guilty. And little by little, they're taking over more and more. And now you even have, and I've heard, Mitt Romney's criticism saying that Biden has too many woke advisors. And I'm like, so what's the alternative? Asleep advisors? And this constant move by conservatives to, just own certain moves by the Democrats and then characterize them in such a way that it's poison to even touch it or be considered to be associated with it. And Democrats just letting it happen. This is the one time that we're seeing the Republicans running up against a brick wall, because you're not running against a politician. You're running against Disney. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I mean, it's a variation on a theme that Republicans, but white people really have used for years in this country. It's all about culture. So-called culture wars is what has sort of come to be known. And it really has to do with the fundamental insecurity white people have about their view that they're losing control of their country, that they feel they have this birthright deal with. So whenever they feel that it's being attacked, whenever they feel it is being undermined, whenever they think that the worldview that they believe should be predominant is losing ground, they become very anxiety ridden. And it's not Republicans or Democrats, it's really white people. And this resonates with them across the country. And so when you talk about this woke thing, it really is just a substitute for, you're trying to make white not cool anymore. We were the coolest people on the planet forever, and now you tell us we're not the cool kids anymore. We don't get to sit at the prime table in the lunchroom because now you're telling us that we were mean to these black kids or these Hispanic kids or these foreign kids or these gay kids or these short kids or these fat kids. And we weren't mean to them. We just were in charge, and that's what we do. And they have a really difficult time processing this. And so I'm really concerned that all the jobs that a company like Disney creates, or any large corporate company in America, and again, as we say in law school, I hold no brief for corporate America, but any of these companies who employ large numbers of people, when you vote against your own economic interests, when you vote against your own socio-cultural interests, when you tell Disney, who is paying for the infrastructure in 2 counties in which they have roughly 400 acres of property, that we're now going to create, and I talked about this in class with you, Mr. Taylor, an unfunded mandate to tell those counties, you now have to take care of that infrastructure expense. We're not giving any money for it. We're just taking it away, because Disney is part of the tax break deal. In exchange for the tax break, they had to put in and maintain the infrastructure. So you're going to increase the taxes to all these people in Osceola and Orange counties because you don't agree with what Disney's position on a issue of so-called public import is. And why isn't every person who's going to lose a job who's working for Disney, every taxpayer in Osceola and Orange County saying, wait a minute, you can't increase my taxes for that. Let them say what they want to say. We don't have to do it, but let them say what they have to say. So rather than rise up against that, they go, well, it's okay. We don't like this woke thing. They're trying to indoctrinate our children. They're trying to groom our children with this homosexual thing. They're trying to take away our ability to not feel bad about being told that we created slavery. It's nuts. But those cultural issues are real. They hit at the very core of so many Americans who happen to be white, and they are easily led down a path that says, I'm defending white culture from an assault by these non-white people.
But do you guys honestly believe that these folks who are so up in arms about the indoctrination of their children by Disney and the libs, like they like to troll, do you think that would lead them to even consider boycotting anything that they have that deals with Disney, subscriptions to Disney Plus, trips that they had planned for the summer? I mean, I don't think that that's going to get that far. That's why I think this whole feud was bound to fail. You're not going to, good and well, you're not going to cut yourself off from Disney. You're still going to support the corporation. You're going to go on Facebook and share the articles and write things on Twitter. But when this cloud goes away, you're still going to be, someone who contributes to this corporation.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. But they will be voting against their own economic interests. I mean, they will vote against their economic interests by keeping DeSantis and that crew in power. But they will continue to support Disney. They'll subscribe to Disney Plus. They'll do that. They'll go see Disney movies with their kids. They'll buy those CDs. But that's not going to keep them from. They're not going to unelect Ron DeSantis.
So in other words, he ends up even though this was a failed feat to begin with, he comes out as the warrior who tried, and so his credentials bolster up in that world, in Trump world, especially when he's starting to pad his resume. And he reminds me of how conservatives, let me not say reminds because I wasn't even, but from what I've read in the 90s, the way that the conservatives were pushing Bush in 94 when he beat the Democratic incumbent, and he seemed to fit all the boxes, And so by the time 2000 comes around, 1999, 2000, he's running on this compassionate conservative who comes across as reasonable, but still looking to implement the same tax cuts that, the same kind of conservative policies, hardline policies that Republicans wanted. DeSantis looks like he's trying to fit himself in that same mold, going forward. But, as the conversation is moving along, another issue, unless anyone else has anything to add.
Well, Mike, what you said about Bush is true, but Bush also knew how to throw meat at the crazies when it mattered, right? In 2004, part of his re-election campaign, from what I've read, because I was 6 years old at the time, so not really in the know, like you have to put that out there.
Very hurtful. That's very, very hurtful.
Part of his re-election campaign was a national amendment to ban same-sex marriage, and that's with his vice president having a daughter who was openly lesbian. And that was a huge part in Ohio turning red and handing him the White House for another 4 years. As far as coming of age during this time, I'm old enough to remember a time when the common conservative argument against marriage equality was that people would start marrying their dogs and their cats and their horses, never mind that, a dog, a cat, and a horse can't sign a marriage license and probably don't have standing in court to contest a divorce. But, sorry to get all law school on you. It's final season. But the point is, these attacks kind of work because they hit people at a very instinctive, almost primal level. So even if it's not actually accurate, in your heart you understand that something might not be right, and it works really well. Look how easily QAnon caught on. Look how every Republican attack against Judge or Justice Designate, as she is now, Jackson, failed until Josh Hawley pulled up she's soft on pedophiles, and that became the whole focus of her hearings. Even as he knew it wasn't true, even as the actual issue, if one existed with her rulings, was more of a congressional one that Congress had the power to fix, this is still something that can hit and stick. So it doesn't matter what the people at the top believe if they know when to turn it on to play to the bottom, because that makes it even more dangerous, in my opinion.
I just wanted to springboard off that point and pretty much share that. And this leads back into the question earlier about midterms and about being able to tell the story. Oftentimes you'll find that Republicans are very good at pretty much communicating the position in terms of a policy position or a legislative position, and pretty much being very staunch around that. I mean, we saw this also happen in Georgia as well, right? With Delta and a lot of the business community, specifically around voting rights as well. And so on the other side of it as well, though, for the opposition that's essentially building up to this, it's really going to take being able to tell that story and shine a light upon folks who are taking a stand against this. And I say this as someone who's from Florida. Oftentimes Florida is sort of painted as this place of really deep red and all of these things. And it really just depends, right, on where you're going in Florida and who you're talking to. But from my perspective, there's this notion of two Floridas, in the sense of Northern Florida being a bit more conservative leaning and Southern Florida being more liberal leaning. But by and large, a lot of folks in Florida, they're really just concerned with folks who can essentially advance their interests. And while that may sound kind of vague or kind of crass, for lack of better words, that's what folks are really concerned with. And so to this point about, or to the story about Disney and Ron DeSantis, and really just the effect of it overall, I think it's just really going to take folks getting out there and being able to tell their story, and for people to see it, to be able to know that it exists, because oftentimes those types of organizing or those types of demonstrations, they fly under the radar. So that's just my take.
Question though to you, Mr. Friedrich, how would people tell their story? Do you think if people told their story, do you think that would actually make a difference?
Well, yeah, because one of the things that was really amazing is the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition that essentially passed Amendment 4, that passed with an overwhelming vote of about 60%. And the Amendment 4 in the Florida, throughout the state of Florida, was essentially saying that nonviolent folks who have a felony and they're nonviolent, they can essentially get their right to vote back. And so you're seeing a lot of ballot initiatives. And this is something that is coming from out of organizing. This is something that's coming out of, people that's on the ground. You're also seeing medical marijuana, right, being a ballot initiative that's being put out there, and people are putting this on the ballot. And essentially, it's pretty much, when the election comes, folks are pretty much codifying this into state law. But then on the other side, right, you're always going to see, I think to a degree, and maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but just in my own kind of line of thinking, there's always going to be this opposition. And so now what happened with these ballot initiatives is that there are a series of kind of policies that have restricted on what's possible on that front. But to answer your question, Star, I do think that once you're seeing people who are organized and they're telling their story, it does make a change. It does make a difference. It just takes being able to get exposure to that and to be able to know that it's happening, because oftentimes it flies under the radar, and the broader narrative that's out there is, well, nothing's going to change, nothing's going to happen. And that's just been my experience.
So another huge move, the Biden administration was a part of was, we've seen that they've extended student loan, the date for student loan forgiveness once again. In addition to that, you also have a lot of, folks on the far left, particularly young people, who wanted to see, sweeping change. They wanted to have a sweeping, debt forgiveness policy in place. They're starting to complain. And I've heard some folks say, if we've had enough money, Biden announced $800 million going towards security assistance and $500 million going towards economic aid for Ukraine. If we have money for that, why don't we have money for, student loan forgiveness? And again, this is not my view. I'm just presenting the argument that I've heard. And of course, the Biden administration's latest effort to focus on targeted loan forgiveness doesn't necessarily call for a sweeping forgiveness program, but it does make it easier, or attempt to make it easier to pay back your loans. When you're looking at this new program, it's actually designed to have you pay back the loan for 20 or 25 years. The education department officials say they would make a one-time revision to millions of borrowers' accounts to compensate for what they called long-standing failures of how the agency and its contracted loan services managed income-driven repayment programs. So it's an incremental program, I should say. The income-driven repayment programs are designed to provide loan forgiveness for borrowers who have been making payments tied to their income for at least 20 or 25 years. This is how it works. It would make a one-time adjustment to borrowers' accounts to provide credit towards loan forgiveness under income-driven repayment for any month in which a borrower made a payment. Someone mentioned in the comment even, the Biden administration has taken this new measure, but I want to get your thought on whether the Biden administration's latest effort as it pertains to student loan forgiveness, do you think that's enough to convince borrowers that the administration is prioritizing this issue?
No, absolutely not. And, first off, when Democrats do these super targeted, here's my proposal for people between 67 and 71 making less than, $65,000 with less than 2 dependents that sunsets in 5 years, who do they think they're actually impressing? It's not doing anything for a large portion of your base. It was young voters that put Biden in the office in the first place. And these new initiatives, which, by the way, public service loan forgiveness and income-based repayment have existed for a while, and they haven't actually alleviated the student debt crisis, because that's what this is. It's not actually helping the people out who are, begging for the help. At this point, there's not a lot that Biden and the Democrats can run on heading into the midterms, right? The American Rescue Plan is going to be, over a year old. So people have spent their COVID money already. The child tax credit lapsed. Democrats let it lapse in December. You can't run on voting rights because Democrats didn't pass voting rights. You can't run on climate because Democrats didn't pass any climate initiatives. In fact, Biden is actually actively trying to lower certain climate standards as it relates to ethanol and gas to lower gas prices. You can't run on immigration because there is no sizable immigration reform. You can't run on healthcare because not even an effort to introduce a public option. And you can't run on ending the pandemic because the pandemic's not over. So there are very few things left in Biden's arsenal to go on. And executive repayment of executive discharge of indebtedness, which is something that people have been pointing out for a while, is baked into the Higher Education Act, is one thing left in Biden's arsenal. So as he does these little things like forgiving student loans for the people who went to Everest and ICDC college and, or Trump University, people who were defrauded with promises of higher earning potential but didn't actually see that potential. It's, it shows that these things are feasible, but he's not actually doing, but, forgiving $10 million of debt at a time is a drop in the pond when there's over $1 trillion in federally held student loans. So this isn't going to satisfy a lot of people. It's not going to satisfy the right people. And it's not going to do much heading into the midterms for Biden.
But why can't you make the argument? You can run on those things, in my view. You could say, look, the fact that we had Susan Collins and her view compromise as it pertains to the American Rescue Plan was moving from about, I think the Republicans were proposing 500,000 in tax credits, and they were moving up just by a small number. It wasn't, anywhere near what the Democrats were putting up to begin with. And then you have Manchin, who was upset that that they included in the American Rescue Plan that even though they reduced the unemployment benefit from 400 to 300, they extended it to last until October of 21, and he was upset about that. So if these folks are so fiscally conservative as it pertains to those government rescue packages, why can't the Democrats say it was not us? We're obviously doing what we can, but give us Democrats who would work with us, and then we'll start to add on to what we've already done as it pertains to this. In the administration's defense, the education department said that the changes that this rule would make would lead to immediate debt collection for at least 40,000 borrowers, and that's in addition to the fact that Biden has already made strides in terms of reducing the debt of folks who are disabled last year. What do you guys think about that?
Well, how much compromising on the American Rescue Plan did Susan Collins do when she voted against it? Not a single Republican on Capitol Hill voted for the American Rescue Plan. There's as much as you can complain about Manchin and Sinema, Biden knew going in that Manchin and Sinema were going to be an issue. There's not anybody who knew that once there was going to be a 50-50 Senate, Democrats are going to have to do a lot of leaning on those two most outspoken members, because it's not just Manchin and Sinema. They're just the ones who are most outspoken, and they're the ones who tend to be the most intransigent, because they're not the only conservative Democrats in the Senate. But you knew going in you were going to have to deal with them. So now that they're an obstacle, you're telling me you weren't prepared. At least that's the perspective a lot of people have, because most voters don't care about the procedural things in the Senate, about 20 hours of debate before, after the introduction of the bill and resolution. They care about the actual tangible results that you give them. So as much as it relates to debt forgiveness, candidate Biden ran on $10,000 and hasn't even done that. As president, he said, "Send me a bill," but this is something that. But we know that thanks to Manchin and Sinema, there's not going to be willingness to amend the Senate rules to allow Democrats to pass a bill on their own, because a bill has passed in the House, but it's not going to see anything in the Senate, and Biden's not leaning on anybody. Biden had Secretary Cardona, who is the Secretary of Education, prepare a memo on whether or not the Department of Education actually can executively discharge these students at least $50,000 of debt for every borrower. But then he had the memo redacted. So how are students and how are student loan borrowers supposed to feel confident in this administration if they're blocking and hiding their own research?
Yeah, so I think it's, and you definitely hit it on the nail. And I think one of the most important things is, people are seeing, like, every year, every election cycle, what do we always hear? This is the most consequential election. This is the most important election of our lifetime, every single time. And so when we finally get to a point where Democrats gain all powers, now granted, yes, the Senate is 50-50 right now, with Vice President Harris being that, tie-breaking vote. But what people are seeing is that Democrats have all the power. There's not divided government. There's unified government. And they said that they would do this, and now they're not doing it. And I really think that you harped on a really good point about with the student loan forgiveness. Yes, right now it is targeted, but for the people that if you want to cast that big net over the people that are like your typical students that went to public or private institutions that have taken out student loans. Like, if you want to reach them, they have to see it like affect them. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how these decisions affects people's day-to-day life. If people that took out these student loans see that, okay, President Biden has now forgiven, as you said, he promised, at least, $10,000, then okay, he said that he would do it, and he did it. But we haven't seen that. It's, again, it's those for-profit colleges, and I get it. A lot of people did suffer for that, and I'm glad that they got that relief that they did. But if we're talking about heading into an election cycle and you're trying to make sure that we can keep power, people need to see some type of tangible result. And they don't, and you're right, they don't care about the procedural stuff. They don't care that Manchin and Sinema are holding up a lot of initiatives. They don't care. All they see is Democrats have power and things haven't been done that they promised. And yes, and I think it is important to note too that, you know, we live in a 24-hour news cycle, so things run quick. And like we're like literally still only, we're just in the beginning of the president's second year in office. You know, it may feel like we're already in the third or fourth year, but we're still in the second year. And so there should be an opportunity for him to still give him some more time. So I don't know if this is something that's going to happen right before midterms or something that's going to happen in 2020 in the 2024 election cycle. But I definitely agree that student loan borrowers, you know, a majority of them that is affected by it, definitely I'm hoping that there will be some type of relief that we can see for that, because I think that that's something that is going to be important, you know, especially for the administration if they want to run on this. So
this is the thing. I think that, you know, I hear the argument from you guys, you know, folks don't really understand or appreciate the procedural, but they need to, because when the other side gets in, that's not even going to be on the table. Like they're not even going to be considering reducing any student loan. So it's like if you don't care, you need to start caring, because you know, when you're looking at, well, first of all, it's like, what would you have Biden do? You know, with the numbers that we have, okay, what would you do differently to get the ball rolling?
Sign the executive order.
An executive order doing what?
Well, if the prevailing theory is that the Higher Education Act allows the Secretary of Education to discharge student debt, I would have Biden sign the executive order. But that's such a large, huge step that a guy like Biden is not willing to take, you know, for Biden's own personal reasons. That is a huge step, and Biden is not the kind of guy to break a precedent like that. Even, you know, the argument that you see from other people who argue against that is that, you know, the courts would get involved, and the federal courts are so conservative that we might not, you know, see that. You know, personally, I don't buy that argument very much. As conservative as the courts are, I might be naive enough to, you know, hope that certain certain precedent regarding administrative law is still followed, and that at least is the one thing that judges are institutionalist enough about. But even then, if this is something Biden does that the courts subsequently knock down, he still gets to say, look, I tried to do this thing for you, and then the evil radical courts knocked it, overturned it. So you should give me more Democrats in the Senate, and you should give me more Democrats in the House so I can fix it. But Biden's never going to do that.
But it doesn't work that way. If you're the president of the United States and you take an L, you're a loser. You cannot continue to use the power of the office when you are operating below sea level. The threat that the 200 plus judges that Donald Trump appointed in 4 years would get one of these cases and run it the wrong way, like this nut in Florida. Sorry about that, Mr. Frederick. This nut in Florida did with the CDC rule is great. Because this is not easy. I mean, what the president is being asked to do is really largely extraordinary, because it is an executive action that will undo the will of the Congress. That's hard to do. So yeah, you need to be cautious, because if you take that hit, then you've got the Repubs saying the guy's lawless. Now, it doesn't make any sense whether it's true or not. That's what they're going to beat him across the head with. So I think I agree with you, Mr. Honoré. Joe Biden is not built for that kind of fight. He is a compromise kind of guy. He always wants to be in the middle. So I agree with you that it is not intuitively or inherently in him to take on this challenge. He would have to be on what he would perceive as be extremely firm legal ground before he would even leap out there. And then even then he might not do it. So I think that, you know, as Mr. Taylor said, what would you have him do? Do you want him to take this L that there's a high risk of? There is this other reality out there that you guys may not get, I get the group of people behind me are saying to you people, well, wait a minute, I paid my friggin' loans. How come they can't pay theirs? There is that part of the electorate that's speaking out to Joe Biden. Now, I think those guys are kind of selfish and wacky, and I don't quite get that, but I understand that that's real too. That's part of the political framework or apparatus that Mr. Biden has got to, and his colleagues have got to work in. I think they badly oversold the idea that they were in charge and they could deliver on a whole bunch of things. The numbers in the House don't really turn into a significant majority because so many of the members of the House of Representatives, who have to run every 2 years, are in purple or red-leaning districts where they can't do stuff and get reelected. The Senate is a disaster because you need literally every Democrat senator to vote with you, and you got Manchin and Sinema, and you can't get there most of the time. So it's really not a unified government in the sense of that the Dems control the Congress and the presidency. He really doesn't control the Congress. They're walking on eggshells, and they badly oversold their ability to just get things done because we're in the majority now for the first time. And that was such a foolish political thing to do, I think. And they're suffering from it because they've elevated expectations that they can't deliver on.
I think something that's really interesting about this is not only, you will have that, I guess you could say, commentary from Republicans, but you also will have it from Democrats as well. If you see executive action to essentially release student loans, something that I continuously think about is this a conversation of the Biden administration playing the long game? And what I mean by that is when you had President Obama, who was essentially in the same position in terms of influence and power in the presidency, you had the House and then you had the Senate. You think about the Affordable Care Act. A lot of folks say this is the narrative is this is what gave rise to the Tea Party. And so, that is possibly an unintended consequence here as well. And because of what it gave rise to the Tea Party, a lot of folks say that's what pretty much elected Donald Trump, right? And so it opens up another question. Do President Joe Biden have the political capital, right, to essentially sign an executive order and, to forgive student loans? I think this is where a lot of advocacy groups and organizations across the country who are, and I love Vice President Harris, I love President Biden, but we have to do our job as folks who are advocating for change and who are advocating for reform, as folks who are part of the constituency, to essentially let them know that, hey, this is something that's truly concerning to me, and we want you to understand, where we're coming from. On the basis of folks who have already paid their student loans, I think the issue with that is the servicers. Oh, the student loan servicers, they're just out of whack. They're just doing anything that they want to do. I mean, the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is issued a fine to, I want to say there's Ed Financial. There was a lawsuit with Navient that essentially started under the Obama administration related to folks who are essentially, this lawsuit pretty much is one that says for people who get student loans and they essentially go into the student loan repayment, what a lot of the, particularly Navient, is saying is, hey, push them into forbearance. Don't put them on the IDR, the individual driven repayment plans. Put them into forbearance. And because they're on forbearance, the interest essentially accrues. And so this is why you have the lawsuit, and they pretty much put out a settlement there. And so from all angles, you see this kind of impropriety, right? So personally, I'm someone who advocates for student loan forgiveness because, that's just something that is really important. But it can't stop there, right? Because if we have student loan forgiveness, it may come again, right? We may have this debt again. So I think that it needs to be a more robust and broader dialogue if we're truly going to engage this, for the policy wonks and those policy nerds out there. If we're truly going to engage this, not only student loan forgiveness, but also how do we bring down the cost of college and make it more accessible and affordable too?
Yeah, and listen, I think one of our famous R&B singers said it the best: almost doesn't count. And so it's either you're going to have to, it's going to be important for the president for such a big move that, it has to be right. And it's not going to be, it can't be, well, hey, I tried. Like, well, no, like there needs to be some type of action. And it's definitely, and that's going to require going through the legislative route. And now, depending on how these midterms turn out, would determine that. But if anything, now between now and election day, I highly doubt something like this could happen. Would be the best time and give Democrats their best chances to try at least attempt to address that going the congressional route, because that is going to be the most effective and efficient way to get this accomplished. And like you said, an executive order can be overturned with the new administration. You need Congress to put something actually into concrete. So,
and that really should motivate people to not throw their hands in the air and say, I'm just disillusioned, I'm just jaded, I'm just don't care anymore. I mean, if you want this bad enough, go vote for it. But that aside, Attorney John Eastman revealed Monday that he has asserted attorney-client privilege on 37,000 pages of emails related to his work for then President Donald Trump in the effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The January 6th committee has objected to every claim over these pages, which now sends the dispute to U.S. District Court Judge David Carter for a case-by-case review. The only thing I kept thinking of is my time as a law student a few years ago when I was a 2L, sitting in Professor Worthy's class for professional responsibility and also in criminal law, when we were saying, look, attorney-client privilege does not apply if it's in pursuit of fraud. You can't assert attorney-client privilege to cover up a crime or to cover up some kind of fraud. And I mean, if the overturn of the election wasn't fraud, I mean, what was it? In your view, folks, do you think that this effort by Eastman to assert or to invoke attorney-client privilege would be successful, since this was a commission of a crime?
He doesn't need it to be successful. He just needs to run out the clock. If he can get, November 2022 was closer than we think, right? We're already in late April. And it's once this new Congress gets sworn in January 2023, the select committee loses its mandate. So all he has to do is hang on and avoid turning over these documents that he doesn't want to turn over until this committee can lose its mandate. So it's not necessarily about the privilege. It's about wasting as much time as possible.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's highly unlikely that the privilege would obtain because of the crime fraud exception. I believe that his previous memo, his infamous memo, some of the emails and text messages make it pretty clear that he was involved in a crime with some other people, maybe including Donald Trump, but certainly with some other people. So I don't think the privilege would apply. But I think Mr. Honore is absolutely right. Their only real hope right now is to drag this out, to be as non-compliant as long as possible, and to get on the other side of an election in November 2022, where the Republicans take control of the House of Representatives, and they will promptly kill that committee, and it will have no more power and no more authority, and the investigation goes away. And so you'll never get those documents unless the Justice Department somehow decides that it's prosecutable and they get them subpoenaed for a grand jury. But I don't believe that's going to happen either.
So why don't Democrats go ahead and just start having these hearings? I know, they're piecing together the evidence. There was a call by Trump and Pence that they're piecing together. Why not just expose and get everything out in oxygen first? Let people see it so that when they do pull the rug, everyone understands clearly what they're doing.
Don't know.
It's what they should be doing, but I don't know if Democratic leadership has the ability to dominate news cycles or even has the ability to figure out that all you have to do is get your leaders talking, right? People always say, well, the news doesn't cover it. Joe Biden is the president, Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House, and Chuck Schumer is the Senate Majority Leader. If they say something in front of a microphone, the news is going to cover it for at least an hour. So, just get in front of the microphones and talk, but they're not good at doing that. Pelosi, to her credit, focused on staffing the select committee with, intellectuals and people who are going to take the job seriously, but there's not really a communications or public affairs professional among them. Benny Johnson isn't the kind of guy who can stand in front of a microphone and spin a narrative. As good as he is, neither is Jamie Raskin. So it's a matter of ability, and it's also a matter of hiring the right consultants, because Democrats are really bad at doing that.
So So the last topic for tonight, Ukraine. It was interesting. Putin sent out a threat. Now he had his a huge ship, tank, because of Ukraine's the support Ukraine is getting from the United States. I think the last time something like that happened on such a large scale kind of warship was, you have to go back to 1905. That's embarrassing. If you're Putin, you started this war, you wanted this to be something that was, equivalent to, what you did in, with the Czechs in 1999. But you're obviously in for a bigger fight than you had, and not only that, but they have dealt a devastating blow. So you can talk about Mariupol all you want, but at the same time, this is not a successful battle for you. So he sends out this threat, and he says the United States needs to stop arming Ukraine, or else there'll be devastating consequences. And so Biden still goes ahead and he announces that this week that there'll be $800 million package for security assistance to Ukraine. And I want to get your thoughts of whether or not you think that's risky for the Biden White House to send or to continue to send large sums of aid for the Ukrainians after Putin has made this warning, and not just make the warning, but they recently conducted a successful ICBM test.
Yeah. And I would say, listen, and before I even speak on this, I think everybody on here is pretty extraordinary. But I would love, Star, I would love to just hear your thoughts, to get you in this conversation before I even say anything else.
Well, thank you. Well, number one, I would say war is always risky, no matter what you're going to do. And I think with Ukraine, I think other countries are kind of saying, hey, I think Ukraine's not the only country that's going through war. And so it's kind of like, you want to aid them, but you're not aiding us. I think what Ukraine should have done is, once they got their independence from Russia, okay, just in case, there might be a war, we need to start preparing. They should have started preparing back in 1992. But unfortunately, now they're kind of rushing to us for aid and help. I think the president of Ukraine was more so, hey, this is not going to happen. We're good. And what we're doing in the United States, we're not thinking that Mexico is going to invade us, or I'm in Ohio, that Michigan's going to invade us here. This is just not how it's set up. But in Europe and Russia, you do have to know who you're working with. You might not think that's going to come in fruition, but you do have to prepare just in case. And I do think, Biden's in a tight spot, because it's kind of like, this is one of our allies. Should I help them or not? But I think also with media, with TV, I think he cannot just stand by and do nothing.
Exactly. I think you make a really interesting point. And I think that, obviously, the situation like this can be risky, because, what you're hearing is that, Putin is now trying to show his strength despite all the different economic sanctions, with isolation towards Russia. And, he's at the point where it's just like, well, this isn't working, and let me show you, here's my strength. And I think that a lot of people, on this side domestically, are telling Biden, like, hey, this is a dangerous situation, because now it's just like you're pushing Putin further and further against the wall. And it's just like, with his isolation, he's going to get a little bit more erratic with his decisions. And, there's a concern that, he's going to try to attempt to, show that all the things that all these different countries are doing, NATO is not enough. And he still wants to show some type of dominance. So, i.e., the missile tests and things like that. Very, in a way, performative, but still, could be consequential depending on how we see things play out. So it definitely is. Stars, she says it definitely is like a catch-22 for the president. But since we are America, we can't just sit on the sidelines per se, and especially when you have the president of another country literally pleading with your elected officials via Zoom, saying we need you. Can't turn your back on that. So it's definitely a situation, a sticky situation for the president. But I think that from what we've seen so far, he's been playing his cards right so far with this.
In terms of strategy, during the electoral season, there are always these folks who are kind of ambassadors, whether it's on the Republican side or Democratic side, that talks about the official position, the official party platform, the policy, what it will essentially do. Something that I think will be really amazing is, particularly for Democrats, once they get into office, to take that model and to integrate it into government, because what's happening here is you have people like Jen Psaki essentially communicating, well, this is why we're giving aid to Ukraine, and essentially telling the details bit by bit, take by take. But who watches that? I mean, I watch it, right? But by and large, very broadly across the American public, I don't know how many people are actually watching that. And so it's important to have those folks who are strategically positioned to reach those corridors where people aren't oftentimes listening to this kind of bureaucratic talk that it can kind of seem like sometimes. And I'm saying all that because, the United States position on this front is to provide security assurance to Ukraine. But then you run a slippery slope, because you still have poverty in our country, right? You still have folks in different regions who are, despite the stimulus money, despite the COVID money, and so on and so forth, all the other different, we talked about tax credits earlier. Despite all of those other things, they're still struggling. And so, and I've seen some folks say this, whether it's online, I looked at some polls, they're looking at it like, well, all this money is going to Ukraine, but what about us, right? And I think it's a valid question. It's a valid question, but it takes being able to help folks understand why this is happening and to put it into context. And if they disagree with it, we have an opportunity to do what, as citizens, as folks who are constituents, vote them out. But I don't think people really understand. When I say people, broadly, very broadly, not like individual, but very broadly, of why this is positioned the way that it is.
And it's so stark to see how elections have consequences. I think Zelensky's life was contingent on the election of 2020. And I mean that because, if Trump was the commander-in-chief right now, would we continue to be providing this much amount in aid to Ukraine and taking such a position against Putin, who went to television in his country on yesterday, and just continue to boast about how unique this weapon is, this international continental ballistic missile, and how it will force all those who are trying to threaten our country in the heat of frenzied, aggressive rhetoric to think twice. And of course, John Kirby at the Pentagon comes back and he says, Putin didn't really mean that. He didn't really say, he doesn't intend for this test to be a threat. It's routine. Would we have that same kind of messaging, to your point, Arsene, if we had a different commander-in-chief, if the outcome of the election was different? So I think, you just see how stark and the outcomes of these things could be. But if there's no one else that has anything to say, I do want to thank you, Professor Cook, Star Davis, Arsene Frederick, Chris Harvey, Nate, for what you all brought. I think this is one of the most substantive discussions we've had on the platform. And so I'm appreciative to each of you. With that being said, I want to go ahead and encourage those who tune in on a weekly basis to continue to challenge the news sources that you have, and to refrain from sketchy news sources that aren't based in fact or reality. With that being said, I want to thank you once more. And that concludes episode 62 of The Political Mic. Thank you guys so much.